The mail-order bride's trembling hands gripped the wagon seat as she stared at the painted warriors surrounding her husband's trading post. She had traveled 1,800 miles from Boston, expecting a quiet life on the frontier. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. A terrified Sioux child clutching her skirts, whispering words that would shatter everything she thought she knew. "Papa's in danger. Wrong tribe coming. They kill everyone who helps us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Catherine Mitchell had been in Dakota Territory for exactly 11 days when her world turned upside down. 11 days of adjusting to her new husband, Thomas Mitchell, a fur trader who had seemed kind and honest in his letters. 11 days of learning to cook over an open fire, to draw water from a well instead of turning a tap, to sleep through the howling prairie winds that made their small cabin creak and groan like a living thing. But it was on that 11th morning, while Thomas was checking his trap lines along the Missouri River, that Catherine discovered the girl hiding in their storage shed. She had gone to retrieve flour for bread when she heard the soft whimpering. At first, she thought it might be an injured animal, perhaps a fox or raccoon that had gotten trapped. But when she moved aside the sacks of grain, she found her, a Sioux child, no more than 8 years old, curled into a ball, her dress torn and muddy, her face streaked with dried tears and dirt. The girl's eyes went wide with terror when she saw Catherine, and she pressed herself harder against the wooden wall, as if she could disappear into it. Catherine had never seen such raw fear in a child's face before. "It's all right," Catherine said softly, keeping her distance. "I won't hurt you. Are you hungry?" The girl didn't respond, just stared at her with those huge, frightened eyes. Catherine noticed the child was shivering despite the warm September morning. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a blanket and a piece of cornbread left from breakfast. She set both items on the floor and backed away. "There, you can have these. I'll just be outside if you need anything." Catherine busied herself with her morning chores, all the while keeping an ear tuned to the storage shed. After about 20 minutes, she heard the soft sound of movement. When she peeked through the door, she saw the girl had wrapped herself in the blanket and was nibbling the cornbread with small, careful bites, like a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. Over the next hour, Catherine slowly earned a measure of trust. She brought water, then soup, then sat in the doorway of the shed, talking quietly about nothing in particular, the weather, the prairie flowers she'd seen, how different Dakota Territory was from Boston. Finally, the girl spoke. Her English was broken but understandable. "Sarah," she said, pointing to herself. "Name's Sarah," Catherine smiled. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Catherine. Can you tell me how you came to be in our shed, Sarah?" What came next was a halting, fragmented story that made Catherine's blood run cold. Sarah's village had been attacked 3 days ago, not by soldiers, but by Crow warriors. The Crow and Sioux had been enemies for generations, but this attack was different. It was coordinated, brutal, and targeted. They had come at dawn when most of the men were away hunting. They had burned lodges, taken horses, and killed anyone who resisted. Sarah's mother had hidden her in a root cellar beneath their lodge. "Stay quiet," her mother had whispered urgently. "No matter what you hear, stay quiet until everything is silent." Sarah had obeyed. She had stayed in that dark hole for hours, hearing screams and gunfire above her, smelling smoke, tasting terror. When she finally emerged, her village was destroyed. Bodies lay scattered. Lodges were reduced to smoking ruins. And her mother was gone. "Papa not there," Sarah explained, her small voice breaking. "Papa went with hunters. 5 days hunting trip. He come back, everyone dead." The child had wandered for 2 days, hiding during the day, moving at night until she found Thomas and Catherine's trading post. She had been hiding in their shed for almost a full day before Catherine discovered her. "Your papa," Catherine said gently. "What's his name? Maybe my husband knows him. He trades with many of the Sioux families." "Papa is Joseph," Sarah said. "Joseph Whitehorse. He trade furs with Mr. Mitchell. They friends." Catherine's breath caught. She knew that name. Thomas had mentioned Joseph Whitehorse many times, a Sioux man who was one of his most reliable trading partners, and more importantly, someone Thomas considered a genuine friend in a territory where such friendships across cultural lines were rare and valuable. "Joseph is your father," Catherine repeated, processing this information. "Then you're not just any lost child. You're the daughter of my husband's friend." Sarah nodded, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Papa come back to village, find everyone dead. He think I dead too. He don't know I alive." Catherine's heart broke for this child, and for the man who would return from a hunting trip to find his entire world destroyed. She made a decision in that moment that would change everything. "Then we need to find him," Catherine said firmly. "We need to let him know you're safe." But Sarah grabbed Catherine's arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging in. "No, cannot go. Wrong tribe watching. They wait for Papa. They want kill him too." "Wrong tribe?" Catherine asked, confused. "You mean the Crow warriors who attacked your village?" Sarah shook her head frantically. No, different. White men with Crow, not real Crow, wrong tribe. Wear Crow clothes, paint faces like Crow, but speak English. They pretend to be Crow, but they not. They make Crow look bad. They want war." The implications of what Sarah was saying sent chills down Catherine's spine. If what the child claimed was true, then the attack on her village wasn't a traditional tribal conflict at all. It was something far more sinister. White men disguised as Crow warriors, deliberately attacking Sioux villages to inflame tensions and possibly trigger a larger war. "Sarah, are you certain about this? You saw white men dressed as Crow?" The girl nodded vigorously. "I see from hiding place. One man, he take off paint to wipe face. I see white skin underneath. And they speak English when they think no one here. They laugh about Indian problem and government contracts." Catherine felt sick. She had heard rumors, of course. Everyone on the frontier had heard whispers about corrupt Indian agents, about government officials who profited from conflict, about suppliers who made fortunes selling goods to the army during military campaigns. But she had dismissed such talk as conspiracy and exaggeration. Now, holding this terrified child who had witnessed something unspeakable, Catherine realized the rumors might be horribly true. The sound of approaching horses jerked Catherine from her thoughts. She pulled Sarah deeper into the shed, instinctively moving to protect her. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could see riders approaching, at least a dozen men, heavily armed, moving with military precision. But these weren't soldiers. Their clothing was a mix of frontier gear and Indian garments. Several had their faces painted in what Catherine's limited knowledge suggested might be Crow patterns. Yet something about them felt wrong, artificial, like actors playing a role rather than genuine warriors. They stopped at the trading post's main building. The leader, a tall man with a cruel face and calculating eyes, dismounted and began examining the property. Catherine's heart pounded. If they searched the outbuildings, they would find Sarah. And based on everything the child had told her, these men would kill her without hesitation. Sarah pressed against Catherine, trembling violently. Catherine wrapped her arms around the girl, feeling utterly helpless. She was a mail-order bride from Boston who had been on the frontier for less than 2 weeks. She had no weapons, no experience with violence, no idea how to protect this child from armed killers. Where was Thomas? He should have been back from checking his trap lines an hour ago. Had these men already found him? The thought made Catherine's stomach twist with fear. The riders spent agonizing minutes examining the trading post. Catherine could hear them talking, their voices carrying across the yard. One voice stood out, the leader speaking with an educated accent that seemed completely at odds with his appearance. "Mitchell's not here. The place looks secure. We'll wait. Whitehorse has to come looking for his daughter eventually, and Mitchell was his primary trading partner. This is the logical place he'd come." Another voice, rougher. "What if the girl's already dead? We never confirmed the kill." "Then we wait anyway," the leader replied coldly. "Joseph Whitehorse has become a problem. He's too friendly with the settlers, too influential with the peaceful Sioux factions. His death, especially if it appears to be Crow aggression, will push the militant factions into open war. And once the Sioux are fighting both the Crow and the army, the territorial governor will have no choice but to authorize a full military campaign. That means contracts, gentlemen. Supply contracts, transport contracts, land acquisition opportunities. We're talking about millions of dollars in government spending. Catherine felt Sarah stiffen against her. The child understood enough English to grasp what was being discussed. Her father's murder, orchestrated not by tribal enemies, but by white men seeking profit from war. "What about Mitchell?" another voice asked. "He's seen us." "We can't leave witnesses." There was a pause. Then the leader spoke again, his voice matter-of-fact, as if discussing livestock rather than human life. "Mitchell's elimination can be arranged. An unfortunate accident during the coming conflict. These things happen on the frontier. His widow will be compensated appropriately and encouraged to return east." They were talking about killing Thomas, about killing Catherine's husband of less than 2 weeks, about making her a widow and framing it as collateral damage in an Indian war that these men were deliberately manufacturing for profit. Catherine's fear transformed into something else, a cold, crystalline fury that surprised her with its intensity. She had come west expecting a simple life. She had married a stranger through correspondence, hoping for stability and perhaps eventually affection. She had prepared herself for hardship, for cultural adjustment, for the challenges of frontier existence. But she had not prepared for this, for conspiracy and murder, for men so corrupted by greed that they would slaughter innocent people and ignite wars for government contracts. Sarah whispered urgently, "They go to River Path. Were Mr. Mitchell checking traps? They find him." Catherine's mind raced. She couldn't let Thomas walk into an ambush, but how could she warn him? She was trapped in this shed with a terrified child, surrounded by armed killers who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit mass murder. The riders began moving out, heading toward the river trail, where Thomas would be returning from his morning work. Catherine watched them go, feeling utterly powerless. She counted 13 men, all armed with rifles and revolvers. Even if she could somehow warn Thomas, what could one fur trader do against such odds? As the last rider disappeared down the trail, Catherine made a decision. She couldn't save Thomas by confronting these men directly. But maybe, just maybe, she could find another way. She had to try. The alternative, hiding while her husband was murdered, was unthinkable. "Sarah," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the terror clawing at her chest, "I need you to stay here. Stay hidden, stay quiet. I'm going to try to help your papa and my husband. But I need you to promise me you'll stay safe." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "You come back." "I promise I'll try," Catherine said, knowing it might be a lie but unable to bear the child's fear. "If I'm not back by dark, there's a family about 5 miles east, the Andersons. They're good people. Can you find them?" Sarah nodded again, though Catherine wasn't sure if the girl actually could, or was just trying to be brave. Catherine slipped from the shed and ran toward the cabin. Her mind was working frantically, trying to form some kind of plan. She had no weapons, no allies, no experience. But she had something those murderers didn't expect: knowledge of their plan and a desperate determination to stop them. Inside the cabin, she searched frantically for anything that might help. Thomas kept a rifle above the door, but Catherine had never fired a gun in her life. There was a knife for cutting meat, but the thought of using it against another human being made her stomach turn. Then her eyes fell on something else: Thomas's signal mirror. He used it to communicate with other traders across long distances, flashing coded messages in sunlight. It was crude, but effective. Catherine grabbed the mirror and ran out of the cabin, heading not toward the river trail where the killers waited, but toward the high ridge to the north. If she could reach that ridge before the ambush occurred, maybe she could use the mirror to warn Thomas. It was a desperate plan, with little chance of success. But it was all she had. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her Boston skirts tangling around her legs, her lungs burning in the thin prairie air. Behind her, hidden in the storage shed, a terrified Sioux girl waited. Ahead, on the river trail, armed killers prepared to murder her husband and ignite a war. And Catherine Mitchell, mail-order bride and complete stranger to this violent frontier world, ran toward a confrontation she had no idea how to survive. Driven by a simple, fierce determination, she would not let these men succeed. Not today, not while she still drew breath. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine's lungs burned as she scrambled up the rocky slope, her fashionable Boston boots slipping on loose gravel with every desperate step. The ridge seemed impossibly far, and with each passing second, she imagined Thomas walking straight into the ambush waiting below. Her hands were scraped and bleeding from grabbing at rocks to pull herself upward. But she barely noticed the pain. Halfway up the slope, she heard the unmistakable crack of gunfire echoing from the river valley. No! McKinn! The word tore from her throat as she pushed herself harder, her legs shaking with exhaustion. She couldn't be too late. She wouldn't accept it. When she finally crested the ridge, gasping and dizzy, Catherine collapsed to her knees and frantically scanned the landscape below. The river wound through the valley like a silver ribbon, and along its banks she could see figures moving. But the distance was too great. She couldn't make out details or determine what was happening. With trembling hands, Catherine raised the signal mirror, angling it to catch the morning sun. She had watched Thomas use this device dozens of times over the past 11 days, flashing messages to other traders across the vast prairie distances. But she had never actually tried it herself, and now her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. She flashed the mirror desperately, sending random bursts of reflected sunlight toward the river valley, hoping against hope that Thomas would see it and understand something was wrong. Flash, 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 a frantic Morse code of terror and warning that she prayed he would recognize. More gunshots rang out, and Catherine's heart sank. She was too late. Whatever was happening down there was already in motion. But then, through her blurred vision and tears of frustration, she saw something that made her freeze. The figures near the river weren't engaged in an ambush at all. They were spread out in defensive positions, pinned down by gunfire coming from somewhere Catherine couldn't see. And one of those figures, she was almost certain, was Thomas, taking cover behind a fallen cottonwood tree. But he wasn't alone. Even from this distance, Catherine could make out at least 4 other men with him, and their positioning suggested they had somehow been warned about the ambush and prepared for it. The fake Crow warriors, who had left her husband's trading post, were now engaged in an actual firefight, but not the one-sided slaughter they had planned. Catherine continued, flashing the mirror, though she no longer knew what message she was trying to send. Her mind raced with questions. Who were these men helping Thomas? How had they known about the ambush? And most importantly, would they survive this? The battle below lasted another 10 minutes, though to Catherine it felt like hours. She watched helplessly as muzzle flashes sparked from both sides, as men moved between cover positions, as the choreography of violence played out in the valley below. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. Catherine saw the fake Crow warriors retreating, dragging at least 2 of their wounded with them. Thomas and his unknown allies held their positions for several long minutes before cautiously emerging from cover. Even from her distant vantage point, Catherine could see Thomas scanning the ridgeline, and she knew he was looking for the source of those mirror flashes. She signaled again, more controlled now, and saw Thomas point in her direction. One of the men with him, tall, with long dark hair, even visible from this distance, gestured toward the ridge, and the group began moving in her direction. Catherine sagged with relief so profound she felt dizzy. Thomas was alive. The ambush had failed. But as her racing heartbeat began to slow, new questions crowded her mind. Who had helped her husband? And what would happen next? She made her way down the slope more carefully than she had climbed it, arriving at the base just as Thomas and his companions reached her. Her husband's face was a mixture of relief, concern, and confusion as he pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace. "Catherine, what in God's name were you doing up there?" Those mirror flashes, was that you? I was trying to warn you, she gasped out, still catching her breath. Men came to the trading post. They were talking about ambushing you. I heard everything. I ran to try to signal you. Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to grim appreciation. Your warning saved us. We saw the flashes and knew something was wrong. We were able to prepare. He turned to the tall man beside him. Joseph, this is my wife, Catherine. Catherine, this is Joseph Whitehorse. Catherine's eyes widened as she stared at the Sioux man before her. Joseph Whitehorse, Sarah's father. The man the fake warriors wanted dead. He was perhaps 40 years old with weathered features that spoke of a hard life, but his eyes were intelligent and kind, despite the violence he had just survived. Mrs. Mitchell, Joseph said, his English perfect and unaccented, your husband has told me much about you in his letters. I'm grateful to finally meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Your daughter, Catherine blurted out. Sarah, she's alive. She's hiding at our trading post. The transformation in Joseph's face was instantaneous and overwhelming. The controlled, warrior-like composure shattered, replaced by raw emotion, hope, disbelief, desperate need. Sarah? Alive? You're certain? She's been hiding in our storage shed. She told me what happened to your village. She told me about the men pretending to be Crow warriors. Joseph, she saw everything. Joseph's hands were shaking. This strong, composed man was trembling like a leaf. I found the village 3 days ago. I searched for her body, but... His voice broke. I couldn't find her. I prayed she had somehow escaped, but I feared. She's safe, Catherine assured him. Terrified and traumatized, but physically unharmed. She was worried about you. That's why she was still hiding. She knew they were looking for you. One of the other men with Thomas stepped forward. He was white, perhaps in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent considerable time in military service. We need to move. Those men will regroup and come back with reinforcements. This location is compromised. Thomas nodded. Catherine, these are friends. This is Captain William Reynolds, formerly of the 7th Cavalry. He's been investigating suspicious activity in the territory for the past 6 months. Reynolds tipped his hat to Catherine. Ma'am, your warning likely saved several lives today, but your husband is right. We need to return to the trading post, collect the child, and move to a more defensible location. Captain Reynolds came to find me this morning, Thomas explained, as they began moving quickly back toward the trading post. He's been tracking a conspiracy involving corrupt territorial officials and private contractors who are trying to engineer a war between the Sioux and other tribes. For profit, Catherine said, remembering what she had overheard. They talked about government contracts, supply agreements. They want the army to launch a major campaign because it means millions in government spending. Reynolds' jaw tightened. You heard them say this? Every word. They were standing right outside the shed where I was hiding with Sarah. They talked about killing Joseph to provoke the militant Sioux factions. They talked about eliminating Thomas and making it look like an accident. They discussed it like it was a business transaction. That's exactly what it is to them, Reynolds said bitterly. I've been gathering evidence for months, but these men are careful. They use intermediaries, falsified records, and plausible deniability. What I've needed is direct testimony from witnesses who can connect the conspiracy to specific individuals. Sarah witnessed the attack, Catherine said. She saw white men painted as Crow warriors. She heard them speaking English. Joseph spoke up, his voice strained with controlled emotion. My daughter is 8 years old. Captain, even if she testifies to what she saw, who will believe a Sioux child against wealthy white contractors? It was a fair question, and the silence that followed confirmed everyone knew the answer. In 1876 Dakota Territory, the testimony of a native child would carry almost no weight against respected businessmen, no matter how truthful. "Then we'll need more than testimony," Reynolds said. "We'll need evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Documents, financial records, something concrete." They reached the trading post 20 minutes later, approaching cautiously in case the fake Crow warriors had left men behind to watch the property. But the area appeared deserted. Catherine ran immediately to the storage shed. "Sarah, sweetie, it's Catherine. Your papa is here." The door creaked open slowly, and Sarah's tear-stained face appeared. When she saw Joseph behind Catherine, the child let out a cry that was pure anguish and joy mixed together. She launched herself from the shed, and Joseph caught her, falling to his knees as he wrapped his daughter in his arms. Father and daughter clung to each other, both crying openly, speaking rapidly in Lakota, words Catherine couldn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. Catherine felt tears streaming down her own face as she watched the reunion. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "You did this. You saved her. You saved him. You saved all of us." But Captain Reynolds was all business, scanning the horizon with worried eyes. "This is touching, and I don't want to interrupt, but we have perhaps 30 minutes before those men return with reinforcements. We need to make decisions quickly." Joseph stood, still holding Sarah close. "Captain, what do you need from us?" "I need you and your daughter somewhere safe while I gather the evidence to bring these men to justice. I need Thomas and his wife protected as witnesses. And I need to move fast before the conspirators realize how much we know and disappear." "There's a problem," Thomas said. "Those men know where we live. They know our routines. They'll be watching every obvious escape route. One of the other." Men who had been with them, Catherine hadn't caught his name, spoke up for the first time. He was younger, perhaps 30, with the lean build of someone who spent their life outdoors. "There's a network of caves about 20 miles northwest of here, old mining tunnels from the gold rush days. They're hidden, defensible, and have water. We could hide there while the captain does his work." Reynolds nodded. "David's right. Those caves are our best option, but we'll need supplies, and we'll need to move in a way that doesn't leave an obvious trail." "I can help with that," Joseph said. "I know ways to travel that your fake Crow warriors won't predict, old paths that few whites know about." Catherine looked around at this unlikely group, a mail-order bride from Boston, a frontier trader, a former cavalry captain, a Sioux father and daughter, and several men she hadn't even been properly introduced to yet. They were being hunted by wealthy conspirators with resources and connections, facing odds that seemed impossible, but they were alive. Sarah was reunited with her father, and they had knowledge that could expose a conspiracy that threatened to plunge the entire territory into war. "How long will we need to hide?" Catherine asked. Reynolds considered. "If I can move quickly and carefully, maybe a week. I need to get to Fort Lincoln, access military records, and contact federal authorities who aren't compromised by local corruption. The evidence is there. I just need time to compile it properly." "A week in caves," Thomas said, glancing at Catherine with concern. "It won't be comfortable." Catherine thought about her life in Boston. Comfortable apartments, gaslighting, running water, social gatherings. Then she looked at Sarah, still clinging to her father, and thought about what the child had survived. "I'll manage," she said firmly. "Let's gather what we need and go." The next hour was a flurry of activity. They packed food, blankets, weapons, and medical supplies. Joseph and Thomas worked together to obscure their trail, creating false leads that would send pursuers in wrong directions. Reynolds wrote detailed notes about everything he had learned, creating duplicate copies that he distributed among the group in case something happened to him. Sarah stayed close to Catherine, as if the brief bond they had formed in the shed had created a connection that transcended their different backgrounds. The girl watched everything with wide, solemn eyes, and Catherine realized that Sarah was processing trauma that no child should ever have to endure. As they prepared to leave, Catherine took a last look at the small cabin that had been her home for less than 2 weeks. She had come here expecting a quiet life, perhaps eventually love with the stranger she had married, certainly nothing more dramatic than learning to cook and keep house in frontier conditions. Instead, she found herself at the center of a conspiracy that could change the fate of the entire territory. She was about to become a fugitive, hiding in caves with a group of people she barely knew, hunted by men who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit mass murder. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. And yet, as Catherine helped Sarah onto one of the horses and saw the gratitude in Joseph's eyes, she realized something surprising. She felt more alive, more purposeful, more herself than she ever had in Boston's refined society. The danger was real, the stakes were life and death, and she had no guarantee of survival. But for the first time in her life, Catherine Mitchell felt like she mattered, like her choices and actions could make a real difference. "Ready?" Thomas asked, offering her his hand. Catherine took it, pulling herself up behind him on the horse. "Ready?" As they rode away from the trading post, heading northwest toward caves and uncertainty, Catherine glanced back once. In the distance, she could see dust clouds rising, riders approaching. The fake Crow warriors were returning, just as Reynolds had predicted, but they would find an empty trading post and cold trails leading nowhere. And while they searched fruitlessly, the people they hunted would be preparing to bring them down. The game had changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and a mail-order bride from Boston, who had never imagined herself capable of such things, was riding toward a confrontation that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, justice, and her own strength. The caves were nothing like Catherine had imagined. From the outside, they appeared to be nothing more than a dark fissure in a limestone cliff face, easily overlooked by anyone not specifically searching for them. But once inside, following David through a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber, Catherine found herself in a space that had clearly been used as shelter many times before. The main cavern was roughly 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that even the tallest among them could stand upright. Someone, probably prospectors years ago, had carved crude shelves into the rock walls. There were remains of old campfires, carefully positioned where the smoke would be drawn up through natural vents in the stone. And most surprisingly, there was a small underground stream that provided fresh water, its gentle burbling the only sound in the heavy silence. "We used these caves during the war," Captain Reynolds explained as they began unpacking their supplies. When Confederate sympathizers were causing trouble in the territory, Union loyalists needed places to hide. "These tunnels saved a lot of lives back then." Sarah clung to her father, speaking to him in rapid Lakota. Joseph listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions, his face growing darker with each answer. Catherine could only imagine what horrors the child was recounting: the attack on her village, the days of hiding, the terror of believing herself completely alone. Thomas worked with David and the other men to organize their supplies and establish watch rotations. They would need to be vigilant. If the conspirators somehow tracked them here, they would be trapped with limited escape routes. Catherine found herself with little to do, which left her mind free to process everything that had happened. Just this morning, she had been a nervous bride learning to bake bread in her new frontier home. Now she was a fugitive hiding in caves, having witnessed murder plots and helped thwart an ambush. The transformation was so dramatic it felt surreal. "Mrs. Mitchell." Captain Reynolds approached her, his weathered face showing concern. "May I speak with you privately?" Catherine followed him to a smaller alcove off the main chamber. Reynolds kept his voice low, clearly not wanting to be overheard. "I need you to understand the gravity of what you've become involved in," he began. "The men hunting us aren't just criminals. They're wealthy, connected, and ruthless. I've been investigating this conspiracy for 6 months, and I've watched good people disappear when they got too close to the truth." "You're trying to frighten me," Catherine said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm trying to give you the choice I never got to give those other people," Reynolds corrected. "Tomorrow morning before first light, I'm leaving for Fort Lincoln. It's a 3-day ride, and I'll be exposed and vulnerable the entire time. Once I'm gone, you'll be stuck here with Thomas, Joseph, Sarah, and David. If something happens to me, if the conspirators capture or kill me before I can get help, you'll have no way out of this." Catherine studied the captain's face. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was genuinely offering her an escape. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you're a civilian who got caught up in something that isn't your fight. If you want to leave, head east, back to civilization, maybe even return to Boston. No one would blame you. I can arrange for David to escort you part way. You could claim you knew nothing about any of this, that you were just an innocent bride who fled when violence erupted." "And my husband?" Reynolds hesitated. Thomas made his choice when he befriended Joseph. He knew the risks of building relationships across the cultural divide in this territory. "But you just got here. You didn't sign up for this war." Catherine looked back toward the main chamber, where she could see Sarah still pressed against her father's side. The child had survived horrors that Catherine couldn't fully imagine, had spent days believing herself alone and hunted, had watched her entire world burn. "When I found Sarah in that shed," Catherine said quietly, "she was the most terrified creature I've ever seen. And when I heard those men talking about killing her father, about murdering my husband, about starting a war for profit, something changed in me, Captain." She met Reynolds's eyes directly. "I'm not the same woman who arrived in Dakota Territory 11 days ago. That woman might have run, but the person I am now, I can't walk away from this. Not from Sarah, not from Joseph, not from the truth of what's happening here." Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I had to offer, but I'm glad you're staying. We need people like you, people who choose to act even when it would be easier to look away." They returned to the main chamber where Thomas was spreading blankets to create sleeping areas. He looked up as Catherine approached, and she saw the question in his eyes. She answered it with a small smile and a nod, and the relief that flooded his face told her he had been more worried about her decision than he'd let on. As night fell, they ate a cold meal. They couldn't risk a fire that might be spotted from outside. The conversation was quiet, careful, as if everyone was still processing the day's violence and close calls. Sarah fell asleep against her father, exhausted by emotion and trauma. Joseph held her gently, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real. David took the first watch, positioning himself near the cave entrance where he could see anyone approaching. Catherine found herself sitting beside Thomas, their shoulders touching in the darkness. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. "This isn't the life I promised you in my letters." "You promised me an adventure," Catherine replied. "You promised me a chance at something different from Boston society. I'd say you've delivered on both counts." Thomas made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I never wanted you in danger. When I saw you on that ridge this morning, signaling with the mirror, I was terrified. But I was also—" He paused, searching for words. "Proud! You were magnificent." Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cave's chill. In Boston, she'd been praised for her needlework, her piano playing, her ability to make polite conversation at dinner parties. But no one had ever called her magnificent. "Tell me about Joseph," she said, changing the subject because the emotion felt too raw. "How did you become friends?" Thomas settled back against the cave wall. 3 years ago, I was new to the territory, trying to establish my trading post. Most of the Sioux families were wary of dealing with me. They'd been cheated by too many white traders before. But Joseph took a chance. He brought in furs, I gave him fair prices, and slowly others started to trust me too." He paused, his voice growing softer. "But it was more than business. Joseph saw that I was trying to be honest, trying to learn about his people and culture rather than just extracting profit. And I saw that he was trying to navigate an impossible situation, maintaining his people's traditions while also understanding that the world was changing and they needed to adapt to survive. He speaks perfect English," Catherine observed. "Better than many of the settlers I've met." "Missionary school as a child," Thomas explained. His parents thought education was the key to their people's survival. Joseph learned to read and write, studied history and law, even some medicine. Then he returned to his people and tried to use that knowledge to help them negotiate with the government, to understand the treaties they were being pressured to sign. From across the cave, Joseph's voice emerged from the darkness. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help but overhear. Your husband is too generous in his description, Mrs. Mitchell. The truth is simpler. I saw in Thomas something rare, a white man who treated my people as human beings rather than obstacles or savages. In this territory, that kind of basic decency is precious enough to be called friendship." Catherine turned toward Joseph's voice. "Sarah told me you were on a hunting trip when the attack happened, that you came back to find everyone gone." The silence that followed was heavy with grief. When Joseph finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "We had been tracking deer for 5 days. Good hunting. We had enough meat to feed the village for weeks. We were celebrating, planning the feast we would have when we returned. And then we saw the smoke." He paused, and Catherine heard him take a shaky breath. "We rode as fast as we could, but by the time we arrived, everything was already over. The fires had burned themselves out. The bodies were cold. And my wife—" His voice broke completely. Sarah stirred in her sleep, and Joseph immediately quieted, stroking her hair with infinite gentleness. When he continued, his voice was barely a whisper. "I searched for Sarah's body for hours. Part of me died with every lodge I searched, every small form I found that wasn't her. When I couldn't find her, I didn't know whether to hope or despair. I wanted to believe she had escaped, but I also knew what it would mean for an 8-year-old girl alone on the prairie." "She's remarkable," Catherine said. "Brave and smart. She survived by her wits." "She's her mother's daughter," Joseph replied, and there was both pride and devastating loss in those words. "Her mother was the strongest person I knew. If anyone could raise a child capable of surviving what Sarah has survived, it was her." Captain Reynolds emerged from the smaller alcove where he had been reviewing his notes. "We should all try to get some sleep. I'm leaving before dawn, and I need everyone sharp and alert after I'm gone." As people settled into their sleeping areas, Catherine found herself lying beside Thomas, staring up at the cave ceiling, invisible in the darkness. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to quiet. "Thomas," she whispered, "what happens if Captain Reynolds doesn't make it to Fort Lincoln? What if the conspirators catch him?" "Then we find another way," Thomas replied quietly. "We survive. We protect Sarah and Joseph, and we find another way to expose the truth. But how? We're just ordinary people. I'm a mail-order bride. You're a fur trader. Joseph is a Sioux man that half the territory would dismiss as a savage without listening to a word he says. How do ordinary people fight wealthy conspirators with government connections?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "My father used to say that extraordinary circumstances reveal what people truly are. Most of us go through life never knowing whether we're brave or cowardly, strong or weak, because we're never really tested. But when the test comes, that's when you discover who you actually are." He reached for her hand in the darkness. "Today, you discovered you're someone who runs toward danger to save others, someone who keeps her head in a crisis, someone who chooses to stand and fight even when running would be easier. That's not ordinary, Catherine. That's remarkable." Catherine squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes. In Boston she had felt invisible, just another young woman among hundreds, unremarkable in every way. But here, in a cave in Dakota Territory, hiding from killers while protecting a traumatized child, she felt seen for the first time in her life. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of strange dreams. Catherine woke several times throughout the night, always taking a moment to remember where she was and why. Each time she heard the quiet sounds of David on watch, the gentle burbling of the underground stream, and Sarah's soft breathing as the child slept pressed against her father. Captain Reynolds woke everyone while it was still dark. He had already packed his gear and prepared his horse. In the dim light of a carefully shielded lantern, he gathered everyone for final instructions. "I'll be gone 3 days minimum, possibly 4 if I encounter problems. David is in command while I'm away. Follow his lead on security protocols." He looked at each person in turn. Stay hidden. Stay quiet. Don't make fires during daylight. If you're discovered, don't try to fight. These tunnels have multiple exits. Use them. If I succeed, I'll return with federal marshals and military support. We'll arrest everyone involved in this conspiracy and put an end to their plans. The Sioux will get justice, and Sarah will be safe to testify about what she witnessed. Reynolds moved toward the cave entrance, then paused and looked back at Catherine. Mrs. Mitchell, thank you. Without your warning, we'd all be dead. That takes courage. Then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying with him all their hopes for justice and survival. The group stood in silence for a long moment after Reynolds departed. Then David began organizing the day's activities, watch rotations, water gathering, inventory of their supplies. It was mundane work, but Catherine understood its importance. They needed structure and routine to maintain morale during the days of waiting ahead. As morning light began filtering through the cave entrance, Catherine found herself sitting with Sarah, teaching the girl a hand-clapping game she had learned as a child in Boston. Sarah picked it up quickly, her small face lighting with something approaching joy, for the first time since Catherine had met her. Joseph watched them with an expression Catherine couldn't quite read. Later, when Sarah was exploring the cave's smaller passages with David supervising, Joseph approached Catherine. Thank you, he said simply, for saving her, for protecting her, for treating her like she matters. She does matter, Catherine replied. Every child matters. That should be the simplest truth in the world, but somehow we've built a society that forgets it. Joseph studied her face. You're not what I expected when Thomas wrote that he was bringing a bride from Boston. He described you as refined, educated, proper. He didn't mention that you were also fierce. Catherine laughed softly. I didn't know I was fierce until yesterday. I'm still not sure I am. Maybe I'm just terrified and doing my best not to show it. That's what fierce means, Joseph said. Being terrified and acting anyway. Not because you're unafraid, but because you're more afraid of what happens if you don't act. As the day wore on, Catherine began to understand the unique challenge of their situation. They had food and water, safety and shelter. But they also had nothing to do but wait and worry. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Would Reynolds make it to Fort Lincoln? Would the authorities believe him? Would they care? Or would the conspiracy's wealth and connections prove stronger than truth and justice? And even if everything went perfectly, what then? Sarah had witnessed unspeakable violence. Joseph had lost his wife and most of his community. Thomas and Catherine's home was compromised, their peaceful life shattered. There was no easy path back to normalcy, no way to undo what had been done. As the sun set on their first full day in the caves, Catherine realized something profound. She had been changed by this experience in ways she was only beginning to understand. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Dakota Territory 12 days ago no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, braver, and more certain of her own strength. Whatever came next, whether Reynolds succeeded or failed, whether they survived or perished, whether justice prevailed or corruption triumphed, Catherine knew she would face it with her eyes open and her courage intact. She had become, quite unexpectedly, exactly the person she needed to be. The second day in the caves dragged with agonizing slowness. Catherine woke to find Thomas already up, speaking in hushed tones with David near the cave entrance. The tension in their postures immediately set her nerves on edge. "What's wrong?" she asked, joining them quietly so as not to wake Sarah and Joseph, who were still sleeping in the back chamber. David gestured toward the narrow opening. "Riders, at least 20, maybe more. They've been systematically searching the area since dawn. They're still miles away, but they're being thorough." "Too thorough," Catherine's stomach clenched. "Do they know we're here?" "No," Thomas said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "But they know we're somewhere in this region. They're checking every possible hiding place, abandoned homesteads, creek beds, rock formations. Eventually they'll work their way to these caves. How long do we have?" Catherine asked. David studied the distant riders through a small brass telescope. "If they maintain their current search pattern, maybe 2 days. Maybe less if they get lucky or someone talks." "Who would talk?" No one knows we're here except Captain Reynolds. The Lakota know these caves, David explained. If the conspirators offer enough money or make enough threats, someone might reveal the location. Most of Joseph's people are good folks, but everyone has their price or their breaking point. Joseph emerged from the deeper chamber, moving silently despite his size. My people won't betray us, not for money and not for threats. But David is right to be cautious. There are always exceptions. And desperate times make people do desperate things. He had clearly overheard their conversation, and Catherine noticed he had his rifle with him, cleaned and loaded. We should prepare to move if necessary. Have secondary and tertiary locations ready. There's an old trapper's cabin about 15 miles north, Thomas suggested. Abandoned for years, but still standing last time I checked. David shook his head. Too obvious. If they're searching systematically, that's exactly the kind of place they'd check. We need somewhere unexpected. The mission ruins, Joseph said quietly. 20 miles east. There was a Catholic mission that burned down during the war. Most people think the site is cursed. Both whites and Lakota avoid it. But the foundation is intact, and there are cellars that could shelter us. Cursed? Catherine asked. A massacre happened there, Joseph explained, his voice heavy. Confederate raiders killed everyone. Priests, nuns, Lakota converts. Neither side likes to remember it, so the place has been left alone. It's perfect, precisely because people are superstitious about it. David considered this. It could work, but we'd need to scout it first. Make sure it's actually viable and not already occupied by someone else with the same idea. I can go, Thomas offered. I know the area and I can move quickly. No, Joseph said firmly. You're too recognizable. Every settler and trader in the territory knows your face. If the conspirators have people watching the roads, you'd be spotted immediately. He paused. I should go. I can travel through country that whites won't follow, and if I'm seen, I'm just another Lakota moving through our own territory. They're specifically hunting for you, Catherine protested. If they catch you, they'll kill you on sight. Joseph's smile was grim. They'd have to catch me first. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been evading cavalry patrols and hostile tribes since I was younger than Sarah. I know how to move unseen. The logic was sound, even if Catherine hated it. Joseph was their best scout, experienced, knowledgeable about the terrain, and capable of traveling in ways that white men couldn't match. But it also meant splitting their group and putting Sarah's father at risk just days after she'd gotten him back. When would you leave? David asked, clearly already accepting the plan. Tonight, after moonrise. I can reach the mission ruins by dawn, assess the site, and be back by tomorrow evening if all goes well. And if all doesn't go well? Catherine couldn't help asking. Joseph met her eyes steadily. Then you take care of my daughter. You've already proven you will. That's why I can do this, because I know Sarah will be safe with you. The weight of that trust settled on Catherine's shoulders like a physical thing. This man, who had lost everything except his daughter, was trusting her with what remained of his family. It was both humbling and terrifying. Sarah woke shortly after, and Joseph spent the morning with her, speaking in Lakota, telling her stories, holding her close. Catherine pretended not to notice the tears in his eyes or the desperate way he memorized every detail of his daughter's face, as if storing memories against an uncertain future. Around midday, David called them together for a grim update. The search parties have found the trading post. They're tearing it apart, looking for evidence of where we went. Through the telescope, they could see distant smoke rising from the direction of Thomas's property. Catherine felt her husband's hand tighten on her shoulder. They're burning it, Thomas said flatly. Everything we had, everything we built. Things can be rebuilt, Joseph said quietly. Lives cannot. You made the right choice. But Catherine could see the pain in Thomas's face. That trading post represented years of work, his entire livelihood, his dreams for their future together. And now it was ashes because he had chosen friendship over profit, humanity over convenience. I'm sorry, Catherine whispered to him. Thomas shook his head. Don't be. I'd make the same choice again. Some things are worth more than property. As afternoon faded toward evening, the tension in the cave became almost unbearable. Joseph prepared for his scouting mission, checking his weapons, gathering supplies, speaking final instructions to David about Sarah's care. The child watched her father with huge, frightened eyes, understanding that he was leaving, but not understanding why. "I'm going to find us a new safe place," Joseph told her in English so everyone could understand. "A place where you'll be even safer than here. But I need you to be brave while I'm gone, just like you were brave when you hid from the bad men. Can you do that for me?" Sarah nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "You come back? Promise?" Joseph pulled her close. "I promise I will do everything in my power to come back to you. And if something happens, if I'm delayed, you stay with Mrs. Catherine. She'll protect you. She's proven that." He looked at Catherine over Sarah's head, and she nodded, accepting the unspoken responsibility. Whatever happened, she would keep this child safe. As darkness fell, Joseph made his final preparations. He'd stripped down to essential gear: rifle, ammunition, a knife, a small pack with food and water. He wore dark clothing that would blend with the night, and he had tied back his long hair to keep it from catching on branches. "The search parties bed down at sunset," he told them. "They're lazy. They think because they have numbers and guns, they don't need to be vigilant." "I'll slip past them easily enough," David clasped his arm. 3 shots, evenly spaced. "That's the signal if you run into trouble we need to know about. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow evening." Joseph nodded, then knelt beside Sarah one more time. He spoke to her in Lakota, words Catherine couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear: a father's love, a father's promise, a father's farewell that might be temporary or permanent. Then he was gone, melting into the darkness beyond the cave entrance, with such complete silence that Catherine blinked and wondered if he had ever been there at all. Sarah stood at the cave mouth, staring into the night, silent tears streaming down her face. Catherine approached slowly and put a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "He'll come back," she said, hoping it was true. "Mama said she'd come back too," Sarah whispered. But she didn't. The simple, devastating truth of it left Catherine without words. She couldn't promise Sarah that Joseph would return safely, couldn't guarantee that this child wouldn't lose her only remaining parent. All she could do was be present, be steady, be someone Sarah could depend on in this moment. "Come on," Catherine said softly. "Let's get you some food. You need to keep your strength up." The night stretched endlessly. David maintained watch while Thomas tried to rest, but Catherine could tell from his breathing that he wasn't sleeping. She sat with Sarah, who eventually dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes, as if from nightmares. Around midnight, they heard horses in the distance. David gestured urgently for complete silence, and they all froze. The sound grew closer, multiple riders moving slowly, searching. Catherine held Sarah close, one hand over the child's mouth to prevent any sound, though Sarah remained perfectly still, having learned through trauma how to be invisible when necessary. The riders passed within 100 yards of the cave entrance. Catherine could hear their voices, rough and casual, making jokes about Indian hunting and speculating about the bounties they'd collect. Her blood ran cold at the casual cruelty in their tone. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, the riders moved on. David remained frozen for another 30 minutes, making sure they were truly gone, before finally allowing everyone to relax. "That was too close," Thomas muttered. "They're expanding the search radius. At this rate, they'll find us by tomorrow afternoon. Then we need to be ready to move quickly," David said. "Pack everything we can't afford to lose. If Joseph returns with good news about the mission ruins, we leave immediately. If he doesn't return by tomorrow sunset," he trailed off, leaving the grim implication hanging. Catherine spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every sound, imagining threats in every shadow. Sarah remained pressed against her side, seeking comfort from the only mother figure she had left. Dawn brought no relief. The search parties were visible now in multiple directions, tightening the noose systematically. David counted at least 30 riders, working in coordinated groups, covering ground with military precision. "Someone's directing them," David observed. "This isn't random searching. They have a strategy, probably marked out search grids. That suggests military experience, or at least someone who understands tactical operations. Which means they're more dangerous than we thought, Thomas said. The day crawled past. They ate cold food, spoke in whispers, and took turns watching the approach routes. Sarah barely spoke, her eyes constantly drifting to the cave entrance, as if she could will her father to appear through sheer force of need. Catherine found herself praying, something she hadn't done seriously since childhood. She prayed for Joseph's safety, for Captain Reynolds's success, for guidance on what to do if everything fell apart. She wasn't sure if she believed anyone was listening, but the act of prayer itself was comforting, a way of acknowledging that some things were beyond her control. Afternoon arrived, and still no sign of Joseph. The search parties continued their systematic approach, now close enough that Catherine could occasionally hear snatches of conversation. They were talking about the generous bounties being offered, $500 for the Lakota man, $200 for the trader, $100 for any woman or child with them. They've put prices on our heads, Thomas said bitterly. Like we're animals. That's exactly how they see us, David replied. Obstacles to profit, nothing more. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sarah became increasingly agitated. She kept looking toward the cave entrance, then at Catherine, then back at the entrance. Her distress was palpable, and nothing Catherine said seemed to comfort her. He said sunset, Sarah whispered. Papa said he'd come back by sunset. Sometimes these things take longer than expected, Catherine tried to explain. He might have been delayed by the search parties, or the route might have been more difficult than he thought. That doesn't mean anything bad happened. But even as she spoke the words, Catherine felt doubt gnawing at her. Joseph had been confident he could scout the mission ruins and return within a day. He had promised Sarah he would be back. If he wasn't here by sunset, something had gone wrong. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed mockingly beautiful given their circumstances. Sarah stood at the cave entrance, staring out with desperate intensity, as if she could make her father appear through sheer will. David and Thomas exchanged worried glances. They were clearly thinking the same thing Catherine was. If Joseph didn't return by full dark, they would have to assume he had been captured or killed. And they would have to make impossible decisions about what to do next. The light faded further. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky. And still, there was no sign of Joseph Whitehorse. Sarah's breathing had become rapid and shallow, the beginning of panic. Catherine held her close, murmuring meaningless comfort, feeling utterly helpless. Then, just as the last light faded completely, they heard it, a soft, distinctive bird call that sounded almost natural, but not quite. David's head snapped up and Thomas moved quickly to the cave entrance. The call came again, closer this time. It was a signal, Catherine realized. Joseph's signal, he's here, David said with evident relief. He made it back. Sarah broke free from Catherine and ran toward the entrance just as Joseph's form materialized from the darkness. He was limping slightly, and there was blood on his sleeve, but he was alive and moving under his own power. Father and daughter collided in a fierce embrace, both of them crying openly. Joseph held Sarah with desperate strength, murmuring in Lakota, his voice thick with emotion. Catherine felt tears streaming down her own face as she watched the reunion. Behind her, she heard Thomas let out a shaky breath. And even David seemed to have something in his eye. When Joseph finally looked up, his expression was grim despite his joy at being reunited with Sarah. "We need to talk," he said. "I found the mission ruins, and they'll work for shelter. But I also found something else, something that changes everything." The way he said it sent ice through Catherine's veins. Whatever Joseph had discovered, it wasn't good news. "What did you find?" David asked. Joseph gently set Sarah down and faced the group, his expression grave. "I found proof. Documents, papers hidden in the mission ruins by someone who knew too much. Evidence of the conspiracy. Names, dates, financial records. Everything Captain Reynolds needs to bring down the people behind this. That's good news, isn't it? Catherine asked, confused by Joseph's troubled expression. It would be, Joseph replied. Except the person who hid those documents was Captain Reynolds himself. They're dated 3 months ago, and there's a journal entry explaining that if anything happened to him, he wanted this evidence preserved where the conspirators wouldn't think to look. The implications hit Catherine like a physical blow. You think something's happened to him? You think he didn't make it to Fort Lincoln? Joseph nodded slowly. I think we need to consider the possibility that Captain Reynolds is dead, and we're completely on our own. The silence that followed Joseph's revelation was suffocating. Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her, not literally, but in the sense that everything they had been counting on, every hope they had pinned to Captain Reynolds' mission, suddenly seemed built on sand. We don't know for certain that he's dead, Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. He could have hidden those documents as insurance, planning to retrieve them later. 3 months ago, David repeated, his tactical mind already working through the implications. That means Reynolds knew about this conspiracy long before the attack on Joseph's village. He's been investigating, gathering evidence, hiding backup copies in case something happened to him. Joseph nodded, pulling a worn leather satchel from inside his shirt. I found this sealed in a metal box, buried beneath the mission foundation. Reynolds' handwriting, detailing everything, the names of the conspirators, their financial arrangements, their plans to engineer conflicts across the territory. He spread several documents on the cave floor, and even in the dim lantern light, Catherine could see they were explosive. Contracts between territorial officials and private suppliers, letters discussing eliminating obstacles and maximizing conflict duration for profit optimization. Financial ledgers showing payments to corrupt Indian agents, judges and even army officers. This is everything we need, David breathed, scanning the papers with growing amazement. With these documents, we could bring down everyone involved in this conspiracy. This goes far beyond a few fake warriors and one attacked village. This is systematic corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. But Reynolds is gone, Catherine said quietly. And we have no way to know if he made it to Fort Lincoln, if he was captured, if he's lying dead somewhere between here and there. Joseph's expression was troubled. There's more. When I was approaching the mission ruins, I saw fresh tracks. Multiple riders had been there recently, within the last day. They were searching the site, digging through the rubble. They knew something was there. Did they find the documents? Thomas asked urgently. No, Reynolds hid them well, and I was careful to cover my tracks after retrieving them. But the fact that they were looking means someone knew Reynolds used that location, which suggests... He trailed off, the implication clear, which suggests they might have captured Reynolds and interrogated him, David finished grimly. He might have revealed the mission location before they killed him. Sarah, who had been listening intently despite the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. Captain Mann is dead? Joseph knelt beside his daughter, choosing his words carefully. We don't know, little one, but we have to prepare for that possibility. Then we go to Fort Lincoln ourselves, Catherine heard herself saying. Everyone turned to look at her. If Reynolds didn't make it, or if he's been delayed, we take the evidence directly to the military authorities. These documents are proof. They can't be ignored. Fort Lincoln is 3 days' ride, David pointed out. And now that the conspirators know we have evidence, they'll be watching every route. We'd never make it, not all of us, Catherine agreed. But what if one person went? Someone unexpected? Someone they're not looking for? Thomas understood immediately where she was going. No, absolutely not. Catherine, I won't let you. Let me. Catherine interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. Thomas, I'm not asking permission. I'm stating a fact. They're looking for a Lakota man, a frontier trader, and possibly a child. They're not looking for a mail-order bride riding alone, claiming to be fleeing the violence. Joseph studied her thoughtfully. She's right. A white woman traveling alone would draw sympathy, not suspicion. The conspirators' men wouldn't see her as a threat until they recognize her from the trading post. Thomas argued desperately. "Catherine, you were there. They might remember you. They saw me for maybe 2 minutes through a window from a distance," Catherine countered. "And I was wearing my house dress and apron. If I dress differently, maybe borrow some of Sarah's mother's clothing from Joseph's packs, I'd look like a completely different person." She could see Thomas wanting to protest further, but the logic was undeniable. She was their best chance of getting the evidence to Fort Lincoln undetected. David spoke up, his voice measured and professional. "If we're seriously considering this, we need a solid plan. Catherine would need a cover story, supplies, and a route that avoids the main search areas. She'd also need to memorize key information in case the documents are taken from her. I can help with the route," Joseph offered. "There's a trader's path that runs north along the river bluffs. It's longer than the direct route, but it's rarely patrolled because the terrain is difficult. A skilled rider could make it to Fort Lincoln in 4 days using that path." "I'm not a skilled rider," Catherine admitted. "I can handle a horse for short distances, but 4 days of hard riding? I've never done anything like that." "Then we teach you," Joseph said simply. "Starting tonight. We have maybe 12 hours before dawn. I can give you enough instruction to survive the journey." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead he just pulled Catherine close. "This is insane. You've been in Dakota Territory for less than 2 weeks. You shouldn't have to risk your life like this." Catherine held him tightly, feeling his fear and love in equal measure. "None of us should have to risk our lives. But here we are, and I'm the best option we have." Over the next hours, they planned with military precision. Joseph worked with Catherine on riding techniques, how to read a horse's fatigue, how to preserve her own energy over long distances, how to navigate using landmarks and the stars. David drilled her on the cover story they had developed. She was Margaret Williams, a settler's wife fleeing violence in the territory, heading to Fort Lincoln to seek her brother's protection in the army garrison. Thomas assembled supplies, dried food that wouldn't spoil. A canteen, a blanket, a small amount of money. He also gave her his best horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, who had carried him safely through 3 years of frontier life. "Belle knows the territory," Thomas explained as he saddled the horse. "If you get lost or disoriented, trust her instincts. She'll find water and shelter better than you can." Sarah watched the preparations with solemn understanding beyond her years. As Catherine was about to leave, the child approached shyly and pressed something into her hand, a small beaded bracelet, worn and faded. "Mama's," Sarah said quietly. "For protection. Bring it back when you come back." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes as she tied the bracelet around her wrist. "I promise." Joseph pulled her aside for final instructions. "The route I showed you passes through 2 Lakota territories, the Hunkpapa and the Miniconjou. If you encounter any of my people, show them this." He handed her a small leather token, marked with symbols Catherine didn't understand. "It identifies you as under my protection. Most will honor it." "Most?" Catherine asked. "In these times, nothing is certain. But it's the best I can offer." As false dawn began lightening the eastern sky, Catherine mounted Belle, the leather satchel containing Reynolds's evidence secured under her riding coat. She wore borrowed clothing that transformed her appearance, buckskin leggings under a simple dress, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face, a man's coat that disguised her figure. She looked like any of the thousands of frontier women trying to survive in harsh territory. Thomas held Belle's bridle, looking up at his wife of barely 2 weeks with an expression that broke Catherine's heart. "Come back to me," he said simply. "I will," she promised, hoping it was true. David offered final tactical advice. "If you're captured, destroy the documents immediately. Don't let them fall into enemy hands. Better to lose the evidence than let them know exactly what we have." Catherine nodded, her mouth dry with fear but her resolve steady. She had never done anything remotely this dangerous in her entire life. The most risk she had taken in Boston was accepting Thomas's marriage proposal site unseen. Now she was about to ride alone through hostile territory, carrying evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. "Mrs. Mitchell," Joseph said formally, then switched to her first name. Catherine. You are braver than you know. My people have a saying, sometimes the smallest warrior carries the greatest medicine. You carry all our hopes with you? Sarah threw her arms around Catherine's leg one more time, and Catherine bent to kiss the top of her head. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she urged Belle forward. The horse moved smoothly into the darkness beyond the cave, and Catherine didn't look back. Looking back would make it harder, would remind her of what she was leaving behind and might never see again. The trader's path Joseph had described proved as difficult as promised. It wound along bluffs above the river, sometimes narrowing to barely a horse's width, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock face on the other. In daylight it would have been treacherous. In the pre-dawn darkness it was terrifying. But Belle proved sure-footed and calm, picking her way along the path with confidence born of experience. Catherine learned to trust the horse's judgment, to relax into the rhythm of movement rather than fighting it. As dawn broke, painting the Dakota landscape in shades of gold and amber, Catherine caught her first glimpse of the search parties in the distance. From her elevated position on the bluffs, she could see riders spread across the prairie below, still searching the areas around the caves. She had made it past their perimeter, at least for now. The day grew hot as the sun climbed. Catherine rationed her water carefully, remembering Joseph's instructions. Belle seemed to know where to find occasional springs, and twice the horse led them to small pools where they could both drink and rest briefly. Around midday, Catherine heard riders approaching from ahead. She had no time to hide. The path was too narrow, too exposed. So she did the only thing she could. She acted like she belonged there. Two men appeared around a bend, both wearing the rough clothing of frontier scouts. They reined in their horses, surprised to encounter anyone on this remote path. "Ma'am," the older one said, touching his hat brim, "didn't expect to see anyone up here. This trail's pretty dangerous for solo travel." Catherine forced a tremulous smile, channeling every frightened frontier wife she'd ever imagined. "I know, sir, but the main roads aren't safe. There's been terrible violence near my homestead. I'm trying to reach Fort Lincoln, where my brother's stationed." The younger scout looked sympathetic. "Indian trouble?" "I don't know what kind of trouble," Catherine said, letting her voice shake. "I just know there was shooting and burning, and my husband told me to run. Have you heard if the army's sending help?" The scouts exchanged glances. "There's some kind of situation developing, but we don't have details. You did right heading for the fort. You need any supplies?" Catherine's heart pounded, but she kept her expression grateful and frightened. "No, thank you. I just want to keep moving. The sooner I reach safety, the better." They let her pass with warnings to be careful, and Catherine didn't breathe properly until they were out of sight. Her first test had passed, but she knew there would be others. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Catherine's body, unused to long hours in the saddle, began screaming in protest. Her thighs ached, her back burned, and her hands were cramping from gripping the reins. But she pushed on, knowing that every mile forward was a mile closer to help and a mile further from the people hunting them. As evening approached, Catherine began looking for a place to shelter for the night. Joseph had marked several locations on the crude map he'd drawn, places where she could rest relatively safely. She found the first marker, a distinctive rock formation, and discovered a small hollow behind it, sheltered from view and wind. She dismounted awkwardly, her legs nearly giving out. Belle nuzzled her shoulder as if in sympathy, and Catherine patted the horse's neck gratefully. "Good girl. You've carried me well." She made a cold camp, not daring to risk a fire. The dried food was nearly tasteless, but she forced herself to eat, knowing she needed the energy. As darkness fell, Catherine wrapped herself in the blanket and tried to sleep, every sound making her jolt awake in fear. The night was long and cold. Catherine dozed fitfully, dreaming of the people she'd left behind. Thomas's worried face, Sarah's frightened eyes, Joseph's quiet courage. She woke fully several times, each time taking a moment to remember where she was and what she was doing. Dawn of the second day brought new challenges. The path descended from the bluffs toward more open country, which meant better riding but also less cover. Catherine had to trust her disguise and her cover story more than the terrain to keep her hidden. Mid-morning, she encountered a small settlement, just 3 cabins and a trading post. She almost bypassed it entirely, but Belle was showing signs of fatigue, and Catherine knew she needed to rest the horse or risk losing her only transportation. She approached cautiously, playing her role as the frightened refugee. The trading post owner, a weathered woman named Mrs. Garrett, immediately took her in, offering water, food, and sympathy. "You poor dear," Mrs. Garrett clucked. "Another family destroyed by this terrible violence. Something needs to be done about these Indian raids." Catherine bit her tongue, wanting to explain that the Indian raids were actually white men in disguise, but knowing that revealing such information would only endanger her mission. Instead, she accepted the woman's kindness and rested Belle in the small stable. While Mrs. Garrett prepared food, Catherine overheard 2 men talking outside the trading post. Her blood ran cold as she recognized one voice. It belonged to one of the fake Crow warriors she'd seen at her husband's trading post. "Orders are to check every traveler. Heading toward Fort Lincoln," the man was saying. "They think the evidence is being moved. Anyone suspicious gets detained for questioning." "What kind of suspicious?" the other man asked. "Anyone who fits the description, the trader, the Lakota, or a woman traveling with them. Also anyone carrying unusual amounts of papers or documents." Catherine's hand instinctively went to her riding coat where Reynolds' evidence was hidden. She had to get out of this settlement without drawing attention, but leaving too quickly would itself be suspicious. Mrs. Garrett called her inside, and Catherine forced herself to eat slowly, to chat about her brother at Fort Lincoln, to act like a woman with nothing to hide. All the while her heart hammered, knowing that the fake warrior was just outside. That discovery meant not just her death, but the death of everyone's hopes for justice. After what felt like an eternity, Catherine thanked Mrs. Garrett and prepared to leave. The older woman packed extra food into Catherine's saddlebags, her kindness a stark contrast to the evil Catherine was fighting against. As Catherine mounted Belle, the fake warrior stepped out of the trading post. He looked at her casually, just another glance at another traveler. Catherine met his eyes briefly, smiled nervously, and rode away at a measured pace, not too fast to suggest flight, not too slow to suggest she wasn't actually going anywhere. She felt his eyes on her back for the first 100 yards. Every second she expected to hear him call out, to hear pursuit. But the call never came, and gradually the settlement disappeared behind her. Catherine let out a shaky breath. She had passed within 10 feet of one of the men hunting her, and he hadn't recognized her. Her disguise had held, but the encounter had revealed something troubling. The conspirators were getting desperate. They were posting guards on routes to Fort Lincoln, checking travelers, preparing for the possibility that their secrets might be exposed, which meant that even if she reached the fort, getting inside and to trustworthy authorities would be its own challenge. The second day passed in a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Catherine pushed Belle as hard as she dared, knowing that time was critical. Every hour she was gone was another hour that Thomas, Joseph, Sarah, and David remained trapped and hunted. As the sun set on her second day of travel, Catherine realized she had covered nearly half the distance to Fort Lincoln. 2 more days if everything went well. 2 more days of riding, hiding, and praying that she wouldn't be discovered. She made camp in a hollow similar to the first nights, but this time she allowed herself a tiny fire, just enough to warm some water for tea. The small comfort of hot liquid felt like luxury after 2 days of cold food and fear. As she sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the stars, Catherine thought about the journey that had brought her here. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger to this land, a mail-order bride with romantic notions of frontier life. Now she was a fugitive, carrying evidence that could topple a corrupt government, riding alone through hostile territory, with people depending on her courage. She touched the beaded bracelet Sarah had given her, Mama's protection. Catherine prayed it would be enough to see her through the challenges still ahead, because somewhere behind her, a terrified little girl waited for the woman who had promised to return. And Catherine Mitchell did not break her promises. The third day of Catherine's journey began with disaster. She woke to find Belle standing stiffly, favoring her right foreleg. Catherine's heart sank as she examined the horse. There was heat and swelling in the fetlock, likely from the grueling pace and difficult terrain. Belle could still walk, but carrying a rider at any speed would risk permanent injury. Catherine fought down panic. She was still at least a day and a half from Fort Lincoln, maybe more on foot. The evidence she carried felt suddenly heavier, like a physical burden pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't abandon Belle, but she also couldn't waste time nursing the horse when every hour mattered. "I'm sorry, girl," Catherine whispered, stroking Belle's neck. "I pushed you too hard." She fashioned a cold compress from her spare shirt, soaked in stream water, wrapping it around Belle's injured leg. The horse would need rest, days of it ideally. But Catherine didn't have days. She had hours at best before someone discovered her trail or the conspirators tightened their net further. After an hour of agonizing deliberation, Catherine made a decision. She would walk, leading Belle slowly, covering what ground she could while the horse rested. Once Belle seemed stronger, she could ride again, but gently. It would slow her progress dramatically, but it was better than being stranded completely. The morning sun climbed higher as Catherine walked, one hand on Belle's reins, the other clutching the map Joseph had drawn. The terrain here was more open, offering less concealment but easier walking. Every time she saw riders in the distance, Catherine would coax Belle behind whatever cover she could find. Rocks, low hills, scattered stands of trees. Around midday, she heard gunfire. It came from the north. Perhaps a mile away, multiple shots in rapid succession, then a pause, then more firing. Catherine froze, trying to determine what was happening. A battle, a hunt, or something more sinister. Against her better judgment, curiosity and concern drove her toward a low ridge where she might get a better view. Leaving Belle hidden in a ravine, Catherine crawled to the ridgetop and carefully peered over. What she saw made her blood run cold. Below, in a small valley, a wagon train had been attacked. 3 wagons burned, their contents scattered across the prairie. Bodies lay motionless near the wreckage, and surrounding the scene were riders dressed as Lakota warriors, but Catherine had learned to recognize the telltale signs of imitation. The way they sat their horses, the way they moved, these were white men in disguise. As she watched, one of the fake warriors pulled off his war bonnet, revealing sandy blonde hair beneath. He was laughing, joking with another man about the authenticity of their attack. They were creating another incident, another piece of evidence that the Lakota were hostile and needed to be eliminated. Catherine felt sick. How many such attacks had there been? How many innocent people had died to feed this conspiracy's appetite for profit? The bodies below weren't nameless victims. They were people who had come west seeking opportunity, just like she had. And they had been murdered by men pretending to be something they weren't. Also, corrupt officials could justify military campaigns that would line their pockets. One of the fake warriors suddenly looked up toward the ridge, and Catherine ducked down, her heart pounding. Had he seen her? She waited, barely breathing, listening for sounds of pursuit. After several agonizing minutes, she heard the riders moving away, leaving their victims behind like discarded refuse. Catherine remained hidden for another 30 minutes before carefully making her way back to Belle. The encounter had shaken her deeply, seeing the conspiracy's work firsthand, witnessing the casual cruelty with which human lives were destroyed for financial gain. It made her mission feel even more urgent. This evidence she carried could stop not just the murder of Joseph, Thomas, and the others, but could prevent countless future atrocities. She resumed her journey with renewed determination, despite her exhaustion. Belle seemed slightly better after the rest, and Catherine risked riding for short stretches when the terrain was flat and easy. They made slow but steady progress through the afternoon. As evening approached, Catherine spotted a homestead in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see signs of normal activity: chickens in a yard, laundry hanging to dry. It looked peaceful, untouched by the violence that had consumed so much of the territory. She desperately needed information about what lay ahead, and Belle needed proper rest and care. But approaching any stranger was a risk. Still, the alternative was continuing blind, possibly riding straight into danger. Catherine made her decision and approached the homestead cautiously. An older man emerged from the house as she drew near, a rifle held loosely but ready. His face was weathered and suspicious, the look of someone who had learned not to trust easily on the frontier. "Help you, ma'am?" he called out, his tone neutral. Catherine fell back into her role. "I'm trying to reach Fort Lincoln. My horse has gone lame, and I was hoping you might know the safest route from here." The man's expression softened slightly. "Fort Lincoln's still a good day's ride, maybe more with a lame horse." "You traveling alone?" "My husband sent me ahead while he settled affairs at our homestead," Catherine said, the lie coming easier now after days of practice. "There's been trouble in our area. He thought I'd be safer at the fort." A woman appeared in the doorway, the man's wife presumably, and her face showed immediate sympathy. "Henry, bring the poor girl inside, and take care of her horse. We can't send her on alone with an injured animal." The man, Henry, seemed to struggle between frontier caution and human decency. Finally, decency won. "All right, come on then. But we don't have much to offer." Catherine dismounted gratefully, her legs nearly buckling after hours of walking. Henry took Belle's reins and led her toward a small barn, while his wife, who introduced herself as Martha, ushered Catherine into the modest house. "You look exhausted," Martha said with concern. "When did you last eat properly?" "Yesterday morning," Catherine admitted, and it wasn't entirely a lie. The dried food she'd been eating barely counted as proper meals. Martha immediately began preparing food, while Catherine washed the trail dust from her face and hands. The simple act of sitting at a real table in a real house felt surreal after days in the wilderness. For a brief moment, Catherine allowed herself to relax, to pretend she was just a traveler accepting hospitality rather than a fugitive carrying explosive secrets. Henry returned from tending to Belle. "Horse needs a few days' rest at minimum. That fetlock's badly strained. You push her, you'll permanently lame her." Catherine's stomach dropped. "I don't have a few days. I need to reach Fort Lincoln as soon as possible." Henry and Martha exchanged glances. "What kind of trouble are you running from?" Henry asked bluntly. Catherine weighed her options. She could continue the lie, but something about this couple suggested they were trustworthy. Or she could take a risk, a calculated risk that might pay off. The kind of trouble that involves corrupt territorial officials, fake Indian raids and murder, Catherine said quietly. "I'm carrying evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of government. And there are men hunting me who will kill to keep that evidence from reaching Fort Lincoln." The silence that followed was heavy. Henry's hand moved toward his rifle, and for a moment Catherine feared she had made a terrible mistake. But then Martha spoke. "The fake raids," she said slowly. "We've suspected something wasn't right. The attacks don't follow normal patterns. They target specific homesteads, always those with valuable land or resources. And the warriors always seem to escape before military response arrives." Henry nodded grimly. "We've kept our mouths shut because speaking up against powerful men is dangerous. But if you have real evidence that could stop this..." "I do," Catherine said. She pulled out Reynolds' documents, spreading them on the table. A cavalry captain named Reynolds compiled all of this: names, financial records, proof of conspiracy. He was trying to get it to Fort Lincoln when he disappeared. "I'm finishing what he started." Henry studied the documents with growing amazement. "These names, Judge Harrison, Territorial Agent Morrison, Colonel Bradley, these are the men everyone assumes are above reproach. They're the architects of murder and theft," Catherine said flatly. "They've been engineering conflicts to justify military campaigns, which generate enormous government contracts. They profit from every death, every destroyed homestead, every escalation of violence." Martha's face had gone pale. "Our neighbor's farm was attacked. 3 weeks ago. The whole family killed, supposedly by Lakota raiders. But the youngest boy survived. He was hiding in the root cellar. He said the warriors spoke English to each other when they thought no one could hear. That's exactly their method, Catherine confirmed. They dress as Lakota, attack settlements, then disappear. The real Lakota get blamed, tensions escalate, and the conspirators profit. Henry stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening prairie. If you ride straight for Fort Lincoln, you'll never make it. They'll have the direct routes watched, but there might be another way. He turned back to Catherine. There's a telegraph office at Willow Creek Station, about 8 miles east of here. If you could get a message to Fort Lincoln from there, warning them what's coming, the military could send an escort to meet you. You'd still have to reach the rendezvous point, but it would be safer than riding in alone. It was a good plan, better than Catherine's vague hope of simply arriving at the fort and hoping to reach honest officers before corrupt ones intercepted her. But it also meant another detour, more time exposed and vulnerable. How closely is Willow Creek watched? Catherine asked. It's a regular civilian station, Martha said. The conspirators might have informants there, but they can't control everyone. If you went in as just another settler sending a family message, you might get through. And Belle? Catherine asked. She can't make 8 miles, not in her condition, Henry considered. You can take my horse, Murphy. He's steady and sound. Belle can rest here until you come back for her, or until your husband does. The offer was generous, almost suspiciously so. Catherine studied Henry's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motive. But she saw only honest concern and a man who had finally found a way to strike back against injustice he'd long suspected but couldn't prove. "Why are you helping me?" Catherine asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be lying about everything." Martha smiled sadly. "Because we've lost too many neighbors already. Because something evil is happening in this territory, and someone needs to stop it. And because that look in your eyes, that's not the look of a liar. That's the look of someone who's seen something terrible and is determined to make it right." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. After days of fear and isolation, this unexpected kindness felt overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. They spent the evening preparing for the next leg of Catherine's journey. Henry showed her his horse, Murphy, a solid bay gelding with calm eyes and a steady temperament. Martha prepared food for the road and helped Catherine adjust her appearance to look more like a local settler than a woman on the run. As night fell, Henry shared crucial information. The telegraph operator at Willow Creek is named Samuel Porter. He's a good man, honest. But his assistant, a fellow named Jack Reeves, has been seen talking to some of the territorial agent's men. Be careful who you trust when you get there. How will I know which one is which? Catherine asked. Porter is older, grey-haired, always wears a green vest. Reeves is younger, dark-haired, nervous disposition. If Reeves is the only one there, don't send your message. Wait for Porter or leave and try again. Catherine memorized these details, along with everything else she'd learned. The telegraph office layout, the usual traffic patterns, the best times to avoid attention. Every piece of information was potentially life-saving. Before she slept, Catherine wrote a brief letter to Thomas, in case she didn't make it. She gave it to Martha with instructions to send it to the caves if Catherine hadn't returned, or sent word within a week. The letter was simple. I love you. I did what had to be done. Take care of Sarah. Find justice. She spent a few hours in actual sleep, the first real rest she'd had since leaving the caves 3 days ago. When Martha woke her before dawn, Catherine felt marginally more human, though every muscle in her body ached from the journey. Henry had Murphy saddled and ready. The horse was indeed calm and steady, accepting Catherine without fuss. She transferred her supplies from Belle's saddlebags, making sure Reynolds's documents were secure and waterproofed in their leather satchel. "If we're wrong about you," Henry said as Catherine prepared to mount, "if you're working for the conspirators and this is all some elaborate trap, then we're fools and probably dead fools at that." "You're not fools," Catherine assured him. "You're people who chose to do the right thing when it would have been easier to do nothing." That's the definition of courage. So are you, Martha said, hugging Catherine briefly. Godspeed, my dear. Send word when you're safe. Catherine rode out as the sun rose, heading east toward Willow Creek Station and what she hoped would be salvation. Murphy lived up to his reputation, carrying her smoothly across terrain that would have been treacherous on Belle in her current condition. By mid-morning, Catherine could see the telegraph station in the distance, a small building with the distinctive poles and wires that connected this remote outpost to the wider world. A few other structures clustered nearby, a general store, a blacksmith, a handful of houses. Catherine circled the station, observing from a distance. She saw two men inside through the window, one older with grey hair, one younger and dark. Porter and Reeves, presumably. Both were present, which complicated things. Catherine would need to find a way to communicate with Porter while keeping Reeves from understanding the true nature of her message. She tied Murphy to a hitching post and entered the station with affected casualness, playing the role of a frontier wife sending a routine message. The younger man, Reeves, looked up first, his eyes assessing her with an intensity that made Catherine's skin crawl. "Help you, Mom?" he asked. "I need to send a telegraph to Fort Lincoln," Catherine said, keeping her voice steady. "To my brother in the garrison there." Porter, the older man, moved to the telegraph key. "I can take care of that. Name and message?" Catherine had prepared for this moment. "The name is Margaret Williams. The message is Brother James, arriving soon with important family papers from Uncle Robert's estate. Some items require your immediate legal review. Expect me at the usual family meeting place by week's end. Your sister, Margaret." It sounded innocuous enough, a family matter about an inheritance. But Catherine prayed that the military officers at Fort Lincoln would recognize the coded warning. Important papers requiring legal review meant evidence needing military protection. The usual family meeting place was intentionally vague, forcing the recipient to send a response that would allow Catherine to identify a safe contact point. Porter began tapping out the message while Reeves watched from the corner. Catherine forced herself to appear bored and tired, just another settler conducting routine business. But her heart pounded as she watched Porter's fingers work the key. Halfway through the message, Reeves suddenly spoke up. "Margaret Williams, you said? From which homestead?" Catherine's mind raced. "The Williams place south of here. About 2 days' ride." "Funny," Reeves said slowly. "I don't recall any Williams family in that direction. And I make it my business to know the settlers." Porter paused in his tapping, sensing the tension. Catherine felt the situation teetering on a knife's edge. If Reeves became suspicious enough, he might prevent the message from being sent, or worse, he might send his own warning to the conspirators. "We're recent arrivals," Catherine said calmly. "Only been in the territory a few weeks. Perhaps that's why you haven't heard of us yet." Reeves studied her with narrowed eyes, clearly unconvinced. But before he could press further, the telegraph key began chattering with an incoming message. Porter's attention shifted to transcribing the incoming text, and Catherine seized the moment. "How long will a response take?" she asked. "I need to know whether to wait or come back later. Fort Lincoln usually responds within an hour if the message is urgent," Porter replied, still focused on the incoming telegraph. "You're welcome to wait." Catherine nodded and moved to sit on a bench near the window, positioning herself where she could watch both the telegraph operators and the street outside. Every minute that passed felt like an hour as she waited to see if her message would reach honest officers or be intercepted by corrupt ones. The answer would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone counting on her to complete this impossible mission. The hour Catherine spent waiting in that telegraph station felt like a lifetime. She watched Reeves watching her, his suspicion evident in every glance. Porter worked at his station, occasionally sending or receiving messages, but seemingly unaware of the deadly game unfolding in his small office. Catherine forced herself to appear calm, idly examining a months-old newspaper someone had left on the bench. But her mind was racing through contingencies. If the response came back hostile or suspicious, she would need to run. Murphy was tied outside, ready. She had mapped escape routes in her mind during those agonizing minutes of waiting. Finally, after 53 minutes by the clock on the wall, the telegraph key began its distinctive chattering. Porter transcribed quickly, his expression neutral. When he finished, he looked up at Catherine. "Response for Margaret Williams," he said simply, handing her the paper. Catherine's hands trembled as she unfolded it. The message read, "Margaret, Uncle Robert's affairs indeed require immediate attention. Meet Cousin James at the old hunting lodge Thursday dawn. Bring all documentation. Family will ensure your safe passage. And Helen sends love." Relief flooded through Catherine so powerfully she almost sobbed. The message was clearly coded. There was no Margaret Williams or Uncle Robert. This was the military acknowledging her warning and arranging a secure meeting point. Thursday dawn gave her a specific time, and the reference to family ensuring safe passage meant they would send an escort. But Reeves was reading over her shoulder, his suspicion now fully aroused. "That's an odd message," he said slowly. "Mind if I see it?" "It's private family business," Catherine said, folding the paper and tucking it into her coat. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. How much do I owe you?" As she paid for the telegraph, Catherine could feel Reeves's eyes burning into her back. She had gotten her message through and received a response, but now she had to get away before Reeves could act on his suspicions. She exited the station and moved toward Murphy with measured steps, fast enough to show purpose, but not so fast as to suggest panic. She had just untied the horse's reins when she heard shouting behind her. Reeves had emerged from the station, calling to 3 men who had been loitering near the general store. Catherine recognized them immediately. More of the fake warriors, now dressed as ordinary settlers. They began moving toward her with clear, hostile intent. Catherine didn't hesitate. She swung into Murphy's saddle and kicked the horse into immediate motion. Behind her she heard more shouting, then gunfire. A bullet whined past her head, and Murphy surged forward in response to her urgent commands. The town of Willow Creek disappeared behind her as Murphy galloped across open prairie. Catherine looked back to see 4 riders in pursuit, still distant but gaining. Murphy was fast, but he was also carrying a rider and supplies, while the pursuers' horses were fresh. Catherine leaned low over Murphy's neck, urging him on, while trying to remember the terrain Joseph had described. There were ravines in this area, places where a skilled rider could lose pursuit. But Catherine wasn't a skilled rider. She was a Boston woman who had learned to ride out of necessity just days ago. The chase continued for 20 minutes, Murphy's breathing becoming labored, the pursuers drawing closer. Catherine could hear them now, shouting to each other, coordinating their approach. They were going to catch her. Then, impossibly, she heard different gunfire, shots coming from ahead rather than behind. Catherine looked up to see riders emerging from a ravine to her left, at least a dozen of them, moving to intercept her pursuers. And leading them was a figure Catherine recognized even at this distance: Joseph Whitehorse. The Lakota warrior led his men straight at Catherine's pursuers, cutting them off before they could reach her. The fake warriors found themselves suddenly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Some tried to fight, others tried to flee. Within minutes, the chase was over. Catherine reined Murphy to a halt, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and relief. Joseph rode up to her, his face showing fierce satisfaction. "Your husband sent us," he explained quickly. "Thomas had a bad feeling about you traveling alone. He convinced David we should follow at a distance, stay close enough to help if needed. How did you find me?" Catherine managed to ask. "We've been tracking you since you left the caves. When we saw you go into Willow Creek, we positioned ourselves to watch. When shooting started, we came running. One of Joseph's warriors approached, leading a captive, Reeves, the treacherous telegraph assistant. The young man looked terrified, his earlier bravado completely gone. "This one seems eager to talk," the warrior said with grim humor. "He's already offering information in exchange for his life." Joseph studied Reeves coldly. "Then he'll talk to the military authorities at Fort Lincoln. We have enough crimes to lay at his feet to ensure his cooperation." Over the next hours, the full story emerged from Reeves's terrified confessions. He had been paid by the conspirators to monitor telegraph traffic and report any suspicious messages. When Catherine's coded telegram went through, he had immediately recognized it as significant and sent word to his handlers. But his warning had come too late. Catherine's message had already reached honest officers at Fort Lincoln who were preparing a response. "The entire conspiracy is collapsing," Joseph explained as they rode toward the rendezvous point specified in the telegraph. "Captain Reynolds made it to Fort Lincoln after all. He arrived 3 days ago, half dead from bullet wounds, but alive. He'd been ambushed on the road, left for dead. But he survived and completed his mission." Catherine felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Reynolds was alive. The evidence would reach the right people. It hadn't all been for nothing. "There's more," Joseph continued. Reynolds' arrival triggered a federal investigation. Military officers raided the territorial offices 2 days ago. They've arrested Judge Harrison, Agent Morrison, and a dozen others. The conspiracy is being dismantled as we speak. "And Thomas?" Catherine asked urgently. "Sarah, David, all safe. We left them at a military outpost under protection. Sarah's been asking for you constantly. The rendezvous point turned out to be an abandoned hunting lodge, exactly as the telegram had described. When they arrived at dawn on Thursday, Catherine having lost track of how many days she'd been traveling, they found a full military escort waiting. 20 cavalry soldiers under the command of a young lieutenant who introduced himself as James Cooper. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said formally, "Captain Reynolds sends his regards and his profound gratitude. The documents you're carrying, combined with his testimony and the evidence we've already seized, will be enough to prosecute the entire conspiracy network. Within hours." Catherine found herself in an army ambulance wagon, heavily guarded, traveling the final distance to Fort Lincoln. Joseph and his warriors rode alongside as both allies and honored guests, a sight that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Fort Lincoln was a bustling hive of activity when they arrived. Catherine was immediately taken to see Captain Reynolds, who looked pale and weak, but very much alive. His right arm was in a sling, and bandages wrapped his torso, but his eyes were clear and sharp. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, attempting to stand until Catherine waved him back down. "You've accomplished something extraordinary. That evidence reached me just as I was beginning to fear all my work had been for nothing. You survived being left for dead," Catherine pointed out. "That's rather extraordinary itself," Reynolds smiled grimly. "I survived because I was too stubborn to die before finishing my mission. But you completed a journey that should have been impossible. A civilian woman with no training, no experience, traveling alone through hostile territory, outmaneuvering conspirators who've been operating successfully for years. I wasn't alone," Catherine said firmly. "I had help from Thomas, from Joseph, from strangers like Henry and Martha who chose to do the right thing when it would have been easier to look away." Over the following days, the full scope of the conspiracy's collapse became clear. Federal marshals, working with honest military officers, arrested over 40 people involved in the scheme. Financial records seized from territorial offices revealed a network of corruption that stretched across 3 territories and involved some of the most powerful men in the region. The fake Crow warriors were captured or killed in a series of raids. Their leader, the educated man Catherine had overheard at the trading post, turned out to be a former army officer named Marcus Bennett, who had been dishonorably discharged for theft. He had organized the fake raids as a way to profit from the military campaigns they would trigger. Judge Harrison, faced with overwhelming evidence, confessed everything in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. His testimony implicated dozens of others, creating a cascade of arrests and prosecutions that would occupy the territorial courts for months. But the most profound changes were personal rather than legal. Joseph. Whitehorse became something unprecedented, a Lakota, liaison to the military, working to prevent future conflicts and build understanding between cultures. His survival and his daughter's testimony about the fake warriors had shifted perspectives. People began questioning assumptions about Indian raids about who the real enemies were, about whether peace might be possible after all. Sarah, after weeks of trauma and fear, began to heal. She stayed with Catherine and Thomas, who had been reunited in a tearful embrace that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. The child was learning to smile again, to play, to trust that the world could be safe, and Catherine herself had been transformed in ways she was still discovering. 3 months after her desperate ride to Fort Lincoln, Catherine stood on the newly rebuilt trading post porch, watching the sunset paint the Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson. The conspirators were facing justice, the fake raids had ended, and a fragile peace was taking root in territory that had been torn by violence and deception. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About the woman who stepped off that stagecoach 4 months ago," Catherine said softly. "She seems like a stranger now. Someone I barely recognize. Do you regret coming here? Regret the choices you made?" Catherine thought about everything she had experienced, the terror, the violence, the impossible challenges. She thought about Sarah's smile this morning at breakfast, about Joseph's quiet gratitude, about the families who had been saved because someone had chosen to act. "No," she said firmly. "That woman from Boston was sleepwalking through life. She was comfortable but invisible, safe but meaningless. This woman, the one I've become, she matters. Her choices have consequences. Her courage makes a difference." Sarah ran out of the cabin, laughing as she chased a butterfly across the yard. The child's joy, after everything she had endured, felt like a miracle. Catherine watched her with a mixture of protective love and profound hope for the future. "Mrs. Catherine," Sarah called out. "Come see." The butterfly landed on my hand. Catherine walked down from the porch, Thomas beside her, to marvel at the small wonder with the child they had both come to love as their own. In the distance, she could see Joseph riding toward them, returning from another meeting with military officials about peace negotiations. The territory was changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely changing. And Catherine had been part of that change, not because she was extraordinary, but because she had chosen to act when action was needed. As the sun set on another day in Dakota Territory, Catherine Mitchell, former mail-order bride, unlikely hero, and woman who had discovered her own strength, looked toward the future with courage she hadn't known she possessed. The wrong tribe had come looking for violence and found justice instead. A terrified Sioux girl had found protection and love. And a Boston woman who thought she knew who she was had discovered someone entirely different, someone braver, stronger, and more purposeful than she had ever imagined possible. The frontier was harsh, unforgiving, and often cruel. But it was also a place where ordinary people could become extraordinary, where compassion could defeat corruption, and where one person's courage could ripple outward to change everything. Catherine had learned that the hard way, and she wouldn't have traded the lesson for all the comfortable safety of her old life, because some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth risking everything to protect. And some people, whether frightened children, persecuted families, or strangers in need, were worth saving, no matter the cost. That was the truth Catherine Mitchell had discovered in the caves and the prairie, in the desperate ride to Fort Lincoln and the confrontation with evil that followed. It was a truth she would carry for the rest of her life, and it was a truth that had begun with a simple moment, a terrified Sioux girl clutching her skirts and whispering, "Papa's in danger." That moment had changed everything, and Catherine had been brave enough to answer its call. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.